Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third Connect series of the 2018-2019 academic year. My name is Brandon Clark. I'm a doctoral student in the Educational Leadership Organization and Policy Program in the School of Education here at Iowa State University. And I serve on the Division A Graduate Student Committee as a co-chair and host of the Connect series. My co-host, Kanisha, she should be joining us very shortly. But in the meantime, I'll talk quickly about what the Connect series is, what our session for today is focusing on, and then I'm going to hand it over to our very generous panelists to share a little bit about themselves, and we'll get into some questions. So the Connect series is an initiative sponsored by the ARA Division A Graduate Student Committee, which features a sequence of virtual real-time sessions broadcast monthly during the academic year. Each session features a different scholar, practitioner, panelist, and focus on a unique theme related to educational leadership, organizations, and policy. The theme for today's Connect series is the Uncharted Path, Emerging Directions in Educational Leadership Research. Much of our discussion today will try to address the following questions. So what are some developed and underdeveloped areas of inquiry within the international educational leadership literature? Can international educational leadership research inform national research and vice versa? And if so, how? How can international educational leadership scholars ensure that the research is anti-oppressive? And lastly, what advice might our panelists have for emerging educational leadership scholars interested in international research? I'm going to pass it off to our guest to provide introductions. Dr. Klar, if you'd like to go first, that'd be great.
Yes, great. Thanks, Brandon. Well, my name is Hans Klar, and I'm an associate professor at Clemson University in South Carolina. I've been here since 2010, after I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And yes, I'm not sure how much you want me to go into my work at the moment, or just introductions.
No, definitely. If you could talk a little bit maybe about past current research, that'd be great.
Okay. Well, I was really fortunate in my first year here at Clemson to be able to get a small internal grant and to get connected with the International Successful School Leadership Project. And through that, my colleagues, faculty and graduate students here at Clemson were able to get involved with that research network. And through that, we developed 3 case studies of middle schools and 3 elementary school case studies of schools that had been successful in terms of closing achievement gaps and raising the student outcomes. And they were all high poverty schools that were achieving much higher than they would have you would have anticipated using regression analysis. So that really got me started in international education. Since then, we've used a lot of the lessons we've learned from those schools. And I just finished working with a colleague here on an initiative we called the Leadership Learning Project, our leadership learning community. And through that, we partnered with a number of rural high poverty school districts to help them develop leadership coaches. And through the work with the leadership coaches, develop school leaders, and particularly to develop their abilities to lead school improvement efforts. I'm also working on another network called the Rural Innovative School Leadership Networked Improvement Community. So working with folks across the U.S. who are interested in working with rural school leaders and helping them use improvement science to improve their practices. The third project is one we just presented on at UCA, and that is a project we're doing with some colleagues of mine from the University of South Carolina. In South Carolina, schools that are at the bottom 5% of the Title I status are called priority schools, Palmetto priority schools. And so we have been working with some of those schools using the research design for the International School Leadership Development Network. And so we've been learning about what help those schools get off the designation as a priority school in terms of improving learning and leadership practices and the role that the context played in that. So that's some of the stuff we're involved in at the moment here in Clemson.
Excellent. Thank you so much. For our next guest.
All right. Is it my turn?
Yeah, go ahead. Yep, sorry.
All right. So my name is Nathan Okilwa. I am an assistant professor at the University of Texas, San Antonio. I've been here since 2013, so this is my 5th year here. Graduated from the University of Texas, Austin, just north of here. And when I was at UT Austin, I got to know some of the faculty members that were at UT San Antonio. And I was kind of in my final years as a graduate student. And I really got excited about the work that some of the faculty members at UT San Antonio are doing. And I said to myself, just in my heart, I wish I could get, connected to those faculty members at UT San Antonio and do or work with them on some of the projects they were doing, because there was kind of exciting project, more kind of international work. And long and behold, actually, when I completed my program at UT Austin, an opening came about at UT San Antonio, and I got hired. So, and I got introduced to some of the work that the colleagues were doing here at UT San Antonio. It was international work for the most part. So colleagues were doing work around international, with the consortium of International Successful School Principalship Project, ISSPP. And then some other colleagues are also doing International School Leadership Development Network consortium-related work. So that really just got me into the work that I was really interested in and passionate about, and got introduced to that work, and I've been participating in that work up to this point. So I will speak to some of the specifics of the work that we're doing around those two projects later on, maybe. And then because I'm originally from Kenya, I really wanted to do some work around my country of origin. So part of the money that I got for startup funds, I utilized those funds to go back to Kenya and do some work around school leadership in high schools. And I specifically targeted high schools that serve girls only. Maybe I'll explain a little bit. So our country in Kenya, typically, what we call primary, usually primary is K through 8th. Kind of starts co-ed for the most part, so boys and girls schools together, right? And then high schools, for the most part, evolve into these gender-based schools. So girls go to girls' schools and boys go to boys' schools. And that work around school leadership has not been quite explored yet, and I really wanted to explore that work. So I utilized my startup funds to go back and interview principals and teachers and students in 3 what we call national schools, and just kind of to expose the kind of leadership around school leadership and learn some things there. And I'm glad that I utilized those funds to do this. In fact, right now I just came from kind of revising the first article from that work, so I'm excited about sending out that work now. So the other one is around refugee students. So when I got to San Antonio, I got introduced to a teacher who was working with the new arrivals, for the most part refugee students here in San Antonio, and I really wanted to explore that, because again, in Kenya, Somalia, East Africa, and I got into learn about the US. So learn about what they were doing in terms of serving those students. So that's another project that that project look at students now who came to the US as refugees, and now they're in college. I wanted to explore what the experiences have been in US schools, and still working with that project. I've interviewed a group of those, and I hope to extend that project to a bigger group. It's a cohort of students, and I want to extend it to more students than the ones we've interviewed so far. So kind of in a nutshell, those are the kind of few projects that I'm working on at the moment, I've been working on.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Really excited to hear your perspectives on these questions that we have from you, from your experiences working at Scholars and just other experiential knowledge that you have. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the kind of the first question. So in recent years, it seems that the area of international educational leadership research has garnered kind of increased attention from scholars, research organizations, and policymakers. Can you talk about some of the developed and also undeveloped areas of inquiry within the international educational leadership literature? And either person can start too.
Well, I guess I'm most familiar with the work of the International School Leadership Development Network and the International Successful School Principalship Project. In terms of the International Successful School Principals Project, the ISSPP, they have three strands of research. The first one, and the one that's been really the most developed, is looking at successful school leaders. And they've allowed people to define that whatever was the most appropriate way in their own context. That includes researchers from about 20 different nations. So a lot of the work that they've done there, and they're coming up to their 20th anniversary, so they've been going for quite a while. Well, a lot of the work that they're finding around successful school leadership is very similar to what we would identify as transformational and instructional leadership and combinations thereof. And the work that Leithwood had done, things like setting direction and developing people and managing the organization and the instructional program, those sorts of things are very familiar and come out very clearly in that work. More recently, they've been looking at a couple of other strands of research there. One is looking at coasting schools, as some of the researchers term them, schools that have resources and should be doing better than they actually are, and trying to look at the reasons for that. And there's sort of an emerging strand now that Gary Crow and Laurie Johnson from Boston College is now working on, and that's leadership identity development. And that's quite an interesting and emerging piece. But a lot of it really harkens back to the role of context and how the context influences, and that's really the origin of these networks, is trying to look at what successful school leadership looks like across a variety of contexts. The International School Leadership Development Network has two strands itself. One is focused on high needs schools, and in particular what fosters learning in high needs schools, what leadership practices help to build individual and organizational capacity in high need schools, and then what factors influence success of those schools. The other strand in the ISLDN is leadership for social justice. And of course, there's a lot of crossover between those two strands themselves. I think that a couple of the areas that maybe are a little undeveloped, at least within those networks, are thinking about how leaders respond to accountability policies in their respective contexts. A lot of the representatives from the different institutions in these networks are from countries that tend to rate very highly in the international standardized tests, PISA TIMS, and so you know, they also have a lot of stake. There's a lot of pressure on educators in their countries to stay at the top of those standings, and so it would be interesting to look at how they respond. Similarly, how they respond to quality improvement methods. So how do they actually go about trying to engender change and high levels of achievement in those schools? I think the last point I would say is recently I had the pleasure of visiting Umeå University in northern Sweden for 3 months. And it was really interesting to see how educators are responding to the influx of refugees they have in Sweden. And I think that can be said for a lot of countries with changing demographics. How are schools and responding to it? In the case of Sweden, there was such a large influx of refugees in proportion to their population. It really made them question what it meant to be Swedish and what role schools had in trying to help assimilate new refugees while at the same time helping them maintain their native cultures as well. So it was very interesting to see that being played out as an outsider. And we see similar things here in South Carolina with growing Hispanic populations and schools trying to figure out the best way to support those students and their families. So I think that's an area that is yet to be developed, at least within these networks.
So I think Dr. Klar has done a good job of just kind of summarizing some really major gaps in the work around international scholarship. And maybe a couple of things that I would just like to add on from my own personal context, having been born and raised in Kenya and that region of the world. What I've not seen, even in the ISSPP or ISLDN, is representative scholarship from sub-Saharan countries. I've not seen that work represented there in the international work that I've been exposed to. It became very evident when my colleague, Dr. Bruce Barnett, and I were asked to contribute to Encyclopedia of Educational Administration, looking at, for the most part, we were asked to look at the preparation programs. And it was interesting how much there is really scarce research around preparation programs from Africa in general, and most importantly, sub-Saharan Africa. So that I think that in terms of preparation programs and reporting, that mostly comes from South Africa as opposed to any other part of the continent. So that has really kind of interested me in exploring international work, particularly from Africa. And that's why I'm excited about this project that I mentioned earlier on, looking at school leadership from Kenya in this case, and trying to, I think, bring that work to the fore in international literature and representation, international work. So, so those are, I think, that's one way. So look at how leaders, particularly in Africa, do go about leading schools. Preparation of those leaders, and I think it's important to underscore that most of the African countries and most places, most continents in general, I think they lack formal preparation programs for school leaders. Most of them, school leaders just go through the ranks to get to become a school leader. So they don't have well-established preparation programs like here in the US. At least that's what we were finding from the literature that we did with my colleague, Dr. Barnett. So the other one will be what I'm really interested in looking at some point. I hope I can help develop this, is theoretical frameworks that are culturally responsive to the, in this case, again, I'm talking about African contexts. Because, for example, effective school leadership, those those frameworks are mostly Western frameworks, so they come from a Western perspective. In fact, when I was doing my analysis for the project I mentioned earlier about the schools that I looked at in Kenya, I had to utilize the effective scholarship frameworks that have a more. I know they are supposed to be across context, means cultural context, but when I was doing the analysis, it was difficult to apply some of those elements of the framework in that context because it's kind of unique from a cultural, political, and social context. So I think, so what I'm saying is I think developing theoretical frameworks that are responsive to unique contexts like Africa is something that really needs to be explored.
Yeah, I kind of found that very interesting too, and thinking about like the importance of context playing, whether it's cultural, economic, political, could be infrastructure, kind of anything around those lines. But a lot of our models for even, you know, perhaps measuring effective leadership behaviors or leadership effectiveness are based on kind of a Westernized or Anglo-American paradigm. We don't really have those perspectives. I mean, they're starting to become a little bit more literature and literature reviews from Africa and Asia and other places, but we still don't have a ton of knowledge from those areas, it seems like, yet.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have Kenisha's back, so that's good. Kenisha, can you?
Yes. Yeah, hi. Sorry, I was late getting in. I was trying to get my Wi-Fi figured out, and I'm in Starbucks, so you'll probably hear some feedback. But can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you guys both for joining us. And thank you for your responses so far. They've been very thoughtful. I think kind of what y'all were just talking about is really where we were looking to go. So like Brandon was saying, we're seeing that research shows that context plays a significant role in educational leadership and policy perspectives and practice. So with that in mind, can international educational leadership research inform nation-specific research and vice versa? And if so, how so?
Do you want to take this one first, Nathan, or would you like me to?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I like your experience. So
I guess when I think about this question, it makes me think back to that saying about you learn more about yourself and your own country when you travel abroad. And I certainly think that there's a lot to be learned by studying how leadership is enacted in other countries. And, you know, I think there's some examples that we can look to, even if you take something like school community relations. You know, we in our leadership preparation programs, we encourage leaders to work closely with their community, to take the school into the community, bring the community into the school, and these sorts of things. But, you know, that's seen differently in different countries. I remember I taught in Japan for a couple of years, and I was familiar with the teachers in the school, but I also lived in the community, so I saw the parents' perspectives. And the parents never would ever have thought of being involved in school activities beyond, you know, field days and things like that. They wouldn't have thought of interfering with what they would have saw as interfering with education, that they wanted to leave the teaching to the teachers. Just at UCA in Houston last month, I was talking to Ross Notman from New Zealand, and he talked a lot about how he did some work in a very multicultural preschool that had a lot of Polynesian folks, especially Maori, indigenous Maori culture. And their whole perspective of community and what the community's role in raising the children in the preschool was at the total other end of the spectrum. So it was very interesting to see that. And of course, once you become aware that the spectrum is much broader and the options for engaging the community or whatever the case might be, the variable, then you can start drawing on these different experiences when you're thinking about what effective leadership should or could look like in your own context.
Yeah, and you know, I'm reminded of a common phrase that I'm beginning to. I had it a lot in the past. Past presidential election, I had the phrase being evoked: "It takes a village to raise a child." That's not, I think, a Western perspective of things. That's a perspective that I grew up in. You know, literally, it takes a village to raise a child. That's how our context looks at, you know, community and community efforts and child development and all that. I say this to say that understanding that kind of even school leadership and how school is done in general is so unique in those contexts that I don't quite see it here, especially in the in Western countries, which is more individualistic. And I think, and that's why I'm trying to figure out how can we tease out those kind of nuances, even in school leadership, that speak to those cultural and social cultural understanding of life and doing even school. Because again, as I said earlier, most of the Western frameworks get imposed on some of these unique contexts like Africa, and they don't tease out those kind of nuances. And so my hope is that we can learn, just like that phrase is being utilized to evoke certain collaborative efforts. I hope we can learn from those nuances about the cultural collaborative efforts in contexts like Africa that really can help us understand how we can collectively take responsibility for student learning. Because we see, I mean, we talk about educational gaps, achievement gaps, and those achievement gaps have been there for many years, and it seems it will probably require collective effort. That effort of it takes a village to raise a child. I wish we can utilize those kind of understandings that come from cultures like, in my case, Africa, and other cultures as well. Something else I thought about here is just understanding the political context. And I mentioned this earlier. Some of our political contexts and again, I have more understanding of Africa, especially East Africa in this case, or Sub-Saharan Africa. Some of those political and cultural contexts are so unique that I think understanding how teachers and doing school navigates those contexts is important. And it can also inform, I think, the broader understanding of educational efforts in Western countries as well, because we're still struggling with educational achievement gaps even here in the US. How do we navigate with the limited resources that we have in places like Africa? And we still have successful schools, we still have successful students. How can that happen in those contexts, such a limited resources, and have successful students, successful schools, and yet in places like in the US, the poorest of school can be actually middle class school in a place like Kenya, right? And they still achieve. So how do we learn from those kind of resource availability and still utilize whatever we have to make students achieve? I kind of wrestle with this. I don't have kind of a clear understanding how that will apply, but I wish we can be able to tease out that from the research we do.
I think that's a very thinking about the nuances of leadership and how this idea of context. I really liked how you brought it back from like what is considered low, perhaps income here, and the differences what that would look like in a different place, right? A different continent or different countries, and still having successful schools. And it's trying to tease out, like you said, what is it that makes that school successful? What perhaps are the attributes of leaders and things like that? And that's probably something that probably is, I guess, a gap in the research, in the literature. In terms of, I'm going to kind of go to this next question because I think it's important in thinking about conducting research across contexts. So as researchers, we're trained in universities, which is a privilege in itself. And so our lens changes from that, but we're trained as researchers. So we possess, though, a significant power in terms of we decide what issues are important, what questions to ask, what issues should be studied, and so forth. From your perspectives regarding the production and then subsequent accumulation of knowledge across international contexts, how can international educational leadership scholars ensure that their research is anti-oppressive or not further perpetuating the oppression of certain groups or certain nations or certain people?
So if I may start with that one, I've thought about this actually, and again, I have the fortune of kind of being exposed to, in a significant amount of time, both contexts, the US context. I've been a teacher here as well, and I've taught, born, raised, went through school in Kenya and taught in Kenya as well. So I've had, and I struggle with the kind of the international comparative work, because I get to, in my head, I get to compare and contrast, the context in Kenya or Africa and then here in the US. So I wrestle with those ideas. And one thing that I struggle with is when colleagues who are Westerners go to places like, Africa, and they are there for a limited amount of time, and then they come back and you hear them present themselves as experts, in those contexts. I usually cringe when I hear that, because you cannot understand the uniqueness and of cultures that have been there for centuries within a amount of one semester, 1 year, and you bring that knowledge to a place like the US or any other place, and you claim to possess expertise. And I've sat through so many presentations where colleagues pose themselves as experts from having been to places for a short, limited amount of time. I think just being aware of our limitations and our own biases, is our own blind spots, is important. And not to claim that their work is not appreciated. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that being aware that you cannot probably understand all the nuances of a people and claim expertise within a short amount of time. So having said that, I go back again to the frameworks that we use. So most of the frameworks that we use in the international work have been developed in Western countries. So they carry that Western philosophy, Western ideology, Western perspective. And for them to be superimposed on a unique culture, and again, I keep referencing Africa because that's what I know best, I think we have to be thoughtful about how we do that, so that we are not perpetuating the stereotypes and the biases that have existed for a long time about Africa in general. So and that's why I hope at some point I'll be able to do some significant work that can actually bring about some really culturally responsive and context-specific frameworks. In this case, again, Africa, that will bring about some of those nuances I mentioned earlier. So one more point. So what I've seen in the literature, especially in Africa, most of the work that has been done and been written about Africa has been done by scholars, some of whom are Africans, but they are in diaspora. Those are diaspora scholars. So they're not scholars within the, so like me, I've been out of my own context for a while. I'm considered diaspora now. So what I'm doing actually is out of, as a diaspora, not in that context anymore. So, and I've not seen work that has been done by, limited works have been done by our colleagues that are within that context, that work in that context. And one of the reasons is well understood is because of lack of resources. Our countries in Africa, for the most part, don't have resources to invest in scholarship because it requires a lot of money to do scholarship. So most of it is just teaching, heavily on teaching as opposed to scholarship. So that's some of the limitations that we have, and one that there isn't much representation of this kind of work from scholars that are within our African context.
Yeah, that's interesting. And for me, my background in teaching, at least, was teaching English language learners. And so from that perspective, I think you're always aware of the potential to transmit your own worldview through language and through language teaching in particular. So I think that, applying that to this question about how you can avoid being anti-oppressive is bearing in mind what would be oppressive, and that would, so that as Dr. Okilwa is saying, there's potential for you to be oppressive by bringing your own Western, or perhaps, I've been fortunate enough to live in a few different countries as well, and learned very early on that the American view is not always appreciated in some contexts as well. So I think, the first step to the cure in these cases is awareness, and being aware that you bring these frameworks with you, and that they may not be universal. In fact, as we have learned through the research we've done, they aren't always universal. And I think we can just take, for example, something like shared or distributed leadership. Our leadership standards encourage principals to distribute and develop a culture of distributed leadership in their school. But I can think of a lot of places I have traveled or lived where that culturally, that sort of arrangement wouldn't be appropriate, or at least would look very different from what I would expect it to look like from our graduates of our program. So I think, that is being aware of these potential biases in terms of how you gather or collect data, or even the questions that you ask. The other part of your question, I think, is how you can avoid doing that. And I think one of the ways is having as much knowledge about the context going into it, and that's also the nice thing about these collaborative research networks, is that there are opportunities to partner with people from Kenya if you want to go and do research with Kenya. So you can ensure that you're drawing culturally appropriate frameworks, drawing on culturally appropriate frameworks to do your work. And I would encourage people to think about taking advantage of those opportunities.
Excellent.
Thank you. I think those are some really good points, and I think you guys are kind of hitting at future directions for scholars who are interested in taking up this kind of work, and that's where we actually want to go now. If we're thinking about the interest in international examinations of educational leadership and how they keep gaining ground and gaining traction. If you could just give any advice for emerging educational leadership scholars who are interested in international research, what would that advice be? And that could be in terms of research directions, or that could be in terms of just practical advice.
So I think what Dr. Klar said just at the end tail of his comments is important. So we have actual forums that can facilitate that that exposure to international work, like what we've talked about, the international school, successful school leadership, principalship projects, excuse me, and then the International School Leadership Development Network. Those are networks that, you know, bring together scholars from different contexts, and we get to learn from each other. In fact, I said in my initial remarks, that was what really drew me to the University of Texas, San Antonio, because our colleagues there were doing that kind of work, and I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to expose myself to work that is being done around the world. And so there are opportunities to do that. So I would just encourage, you know, seasoned scholars or emerging scholars like yourself, Kanish and Brandon, if you really want to expose to yourself to international work, those opportunities to do that through UCA, through ARA, and other organizations that you may be exposed to. One thing that I'm really hoping in my career to do at some point is, and I think other programs do this much effectively at the teacher education level. I don't see it well having, I don't want to make a general blanket statement here, but the few programs I've seen at the ed leadership level, so because most of the ed leadership we're talking about, you know, training or working with people already teachers and they are committed professionally, right? So they don't get exposure to going to international, maybe international, what's the word? Going to international studies or study abroad just because of their commitment. So they may have done, some of them may have done it at least at the teacher preparation level, but not at the leadership preparation level. So they don't get exposed internationally because of that. And where I was going with this is to say that I'm hoping that, you know, we can come up with arrangements where international programs can have an arrangement where there is some interaction with school leaders as well as scholars as well, so that they can have forums for interactions, and that will kind of expose some people to a different context. And I say this because at some point here at UT San Antonio, they actually had visiting school leaders from I think either Switzerland or Sweden or Australia did come here, and they went to schools, visited schools, and got exposed that way. And so that's another way. And those are potential for scholar practitioners, right, to get exposed to work that is international. So I think there are opportunities for that, and just creating those infrastructure at the institutional level is important to get that work going.
Yeah, I think I would echo those comments that getting in touch with people in these networks, which we would be glad to help people do if they're interested. They could contact us for this information. Also, at least at the University Council for Educational UCA, yeah. Educational Administration. Sorry, it's late here on the East Coast. Or ARA, I mean, they have international community building sessions. You can look for them in the program, and the whole purpose of them is to provide people the opportunity to develop networks with scholars from around the world. And the other thing is to bear in mind, we live in a very electronic connected network world, and so through our libraries, at least, it's very easy to access journals from other countries and to see what sort of work is being done there. You can do searches to find out which scholars in other countries are doing work and which foundations or organizations, and you can find out that sort of information and contact people and you know, start doing some your own digging around too. So there are a lot of opportunities, I think, even for people who don't have the ability to go to conferences and things. They can still reach out and work with these communities.
I kind of just picked up on Dr. Okilwa's point about this exposure. So I'm thinking back on like my coursework in educational leadership program to become a researcher, and I don't know your experiences, but recall being even exposed to international literature from that perspective of leadership. It was very much from American or maybe European, but not, I don't think I read a single article, was given an article, right? And so I'm trying to make that kind of cross maybe like the work that schools of ed could do. I don't know, maybe what your perspectives on that is to, even expose in the classroom or integrate. And then, that might pique people's interest in then doing kind of what you're talking about, Dr. Clark, going to seek out more additional information. That's kind of the track I found my own self on. So maybe I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that reminds me, I came back from living overseas for, I don't know, quite a few years when I did my doctoral studies in Wisconsin, and that was one of the things I was surprised at, how little research there was from other countries. And I'm glad you reminded me of that. I have tried over the years to introduce it to my courses. I'm not so sure that students are always that interested, to be honest, and it's kind of disappointing because I feel like there's a lot of lessons to be learned for us here, but quite often people, want to know what they can apply tomorrow and to their class rather than to think a little more broadly and make those connections themselves. But that means we just, as faculty, we need to do a better job of helping people make those connections and see the value in learning what people across the borders are doing. So, yeah, definitely a lot of growth to be had there.
And I mean, I totally agree with what Dr. Klar is saying, because I've seen even in our own program, it's much more at the master's level where we are dealing with principal preparation. So when you introduce international articles or journals, people just are not interested because they want things that are relevant to their practice. And so when they get introduced to readings that are a complete different context, I've had students make comments that this is not relevant to me. That I don't connect to this. I think at the doctoral level, people may be more interested, but again, for our program, most of our doctoral students are they're already school leaders, so they're principals, they're school leaders at the district level, so they're very local context specific. Unless if we have some students who are interested in going into academia, those students may have a little more, tolerance to a wider range of research. So I think it's true that the reaction, and not to generalize this, but the reaction that I've seen has been a little less interested in international work from our students' perspective. So again, unless if they're interested in going in academia and they have an interest in academic work. So it echoes back to what I said. I think if there is a way to provide forums for people to get exposed to international exchanges of some sorts at the graduate level, that will really be a good way to begin piquing people's interest into international contexts.
Excellent. I don't know if Kanisha, we're just about out of time. I don't know if Kanisha do you have any additional follow-up questions for Dr. Klar, Dr. Okilwa?
No, thank you guys both. I don't have any questions, but your comments just actually made me think about, so I wonder if it needs to be more on a college level or department level. If we're thinking about students engaging in international research and we want them to do that, then maybe, it needs to be a part of our mission statements. It needs to be a part of something that we're saying is important. And I think that's kind of something that would show that it's value and that we value other contexts. And maybe students are interested in it, but going back to once they get engaged in it, then maybe they'll see the value. And if we stayed up front, this is important for your leadership here. And we are saying it's important because it's a part of our curriculum that maybe the changes will come from that as well.
Yep, that's a good point.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Klar.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, it is good, but I wonder because there are certain universities that have a mission to be more regional. So how much of the investment in international work or international experiences, I don't know how. So it varies, I guess, from institution to institution. If an institution is more interested in a regional mission, then that's kind of different. And which I think what I've found is College of Education, just because of also limited resources that we have in the College of Education compared to other colleges, our mission becomes really limited because some of these international experiences require quite a bit of financial investment. And if we don't have those finances, it becomes hard to create those infrastructure to have that happen. I see at my own institution here, I mean, if I wanted to run an international exposure experience in Africa, we are talking quite a significant amount of money, and most of our students may not afford to do that, right? So a much convenient place would be like they will go to Mexico. That's the extent of the resources will take them. So I guess it's mission, yes, but again, resources plays into that quite significantly.
It's too bad, isn't it?
I think we've certainly recognized there's a lot we can do with what we already have through selection of course materials and topics and things like that, and that would be a good starting point. Those things can maybe pique interest in programs, and I think you raise a good point as well. I mean, we're a land grant institution. We're very focused on trying to develop partnerships with our local districts and serve the needs of some of our neediest districts.
Right.
So in some ways, bringing in an international perspective could be seen as a distraction, but I think it also could be seen as a helpful approach to addressing some of the problems that we haven't been able to overcome, and that gets back to some of our earlier conversations about looking at different ways of doing things. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth in that regard. We could learn a lot and apply a lot more than we are at the moment. So.
Well, we are just at time, so we both want to be respectful of your time. We really deeply appreciate you both coming on, sharing your insights, perspectives, information, and ways that people can get involved within the international space, within that literature, with that research. I think it's really an important place to be in because of the perspectives that it provides. So I just want to thank you so very much for your time. I know it's valuable, so we definitely appreciate you sitting here for an hour and sharing with us your knowledge.
Yes, thank you both. And we actually, if you have any graduate students who are interested, we host the Connect series monthly, and our next session is next Wednesday, and it will be on self-care in academia. So if you students can watch online afterwards too, so there will be a link and they can just click on it and catch all of the different hosts. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank Kanisha for inviting us to share our thoughts. I was excited when I heard about the conversation around international work, for sure.
Well, good. We're super excited. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Great.